Now, on a bit more of a serious note, we were trying to determine how you'd describe your brand of humor. How would you describe it?
Funny.
There are comedy duos, and then there are Cheech and Chong. Most people think they know the story. Two laid-back stoners who stumbled into fame with weed jokes and wild movies, rode the counterculture wave, and eventually faded into nostalgia. But that version of their story is barely the surface. Beneath the haze of their most famous routines lies a genuinely remarkable biography, full of draft dodging and topless bars, musical careers at Motown, dislocated shoulders at private screenings, and film scripts shorter than a grocery list. The real Cheech and Chong story is stranger, funnier, and more human than most fans ever realize. So let's dig into the facts that the history books gloss over, the behind-the-scenes moments that never quite made it into the documentaries, and the wild turns of fate that created one of the most unlikely comedy partnerships in American entertainment history. Before Cheech and Chong became a cultural institution, they were two completely unrelated men living completely unrelated lives, and the gap between those lives could not have been wider. Richard Anthony Marin, known to the world as Cheech, was born on July 13, 1946, in South Los Angeles. His father was a Los Angeles Police Department officer, which makes the arc of Cheech's eventual career built largely on celebrating illegal drug use and mocking law enforcement, particularly delicious in hindsight. As a young man, Cheech was not chasing laughs. He was chasing art. He enrolled at California State University Northridge with a genuine passion for pottery, spending his time at the wheel rather than at the microphone. But the late 1960s had a way of appending every plan. The Vietnam War draft cast a shadow over the lives of young American men, and Cheech Marin was no exception. Faced with the very real possibility of being conscripted into a war he fundamentally opposed, Cheech made the kind of decision that changes everything. He fled to Canada. He would later describe the choice in simple, direct terms. He did not want to die in Vietnam. There was no ideology dressed up in fancy language, just a young man looking at his options and choosing survival. He landed in Vancouver with little money, no plan, and no particular destiny in mind. He drove trucks. He unloaded carpets. He kept working on his pottery. He was, by most conventional measures, going nowhere fast. Meanwhile, Thomas B. Kin Chong, born in Edmonton, Alberta, on May 24, 1938, had already lived several lifetimes' worth of stories by the time Cheech arrived in Canada. Tommy Chong's background was genuinely unusual for its era. His father was Chinese-Canadian, and his mother was of Scottish-Irish descent, making Tommy one of the very few mixed-race performers who would eventually find mainstream success in Hollywood. But before Hollywood, there was Motown. Tommy had been playing guitar in a rhythm and blues band called Bobby Taylor and the Vancouvers, a group that actually secured a recording contract with Motown Records in the late 1960s. The Vancouvers even helped launch the Jackson 5's career by introducing the young group to Berry Gordy, a footnote to history that most people would never connect to the guy who later became half of the world's most famous stoner comedy duo. By 1970, Tommy had left the music world behind and was running a very different kind of enterprise, a topless bar in Vancouver's Chinatown called the Shanghai Junk. But Tommy Chong was constitutionally incapable of running a straightforward business. He transformed the Shanghai Junk into something genuinely strange, part strip club, part improvisational theater. Between the dancers' sets, his troupe of performers, which he called City Works, would perform original comedy sketches. It was an absurd combination that somehow worked, and it was into this establishment that a struggling, draft-dodging pottery student named Cheech Marin walked one evening in 1970, simply looking for any job that would pay the rent. Tommy saw something in Cheech immediately. Maybe it was the energy, maybe it was the timing, the kind of instinctive comic rhythm that cannot be taught. Whatever it was, Tommy invited Cheech to join the improv group on the spot. Within weeks, something extraordinary began to happen. The two men started riffing off each other in a way that felt less like rehearsed performance and more like two puzzle pieces clicking into place. One night, they fell into an unscripted bit about a man desperately trying to reach his friend Dave, while the person answering the door, so thoroughly stoned he could barely process the conversation, kept insisting that Dave was not there. The audience responded with a kind of wild, delighted recognition that the performers had not expected. It was an accident. It was also perfect. And from that accident, one of the greatest comedy careers in American history was born. Here is something the promotional materials never quite captured. Cheech Marin and Tommy Chong were not best friends. They were not even particularly close friends, in the traditional warm sense of that phrase. In his memoir, Cheech described their relationship as being more like brothers than friends, and he meant that in the complicated, friction-filled way that sibling relationships actually work, not the sanitized television version. Brothers fight. Brothers compete for dominance. Brothers can love each other profoundly and still drive each other absolutely insane. That was Cheech and Chong. Cheech offered a particularly illuminating metaphor for understanding their dynamic. He compared their partnership to the way pearls are formed. An irritant enters an oyster, causes relentless friction, and under sustained pressure, something unexpectedly beautiful emerges. The implication was not subtle. The friction between Cheech and Chong was not incidental to their success. It was the engine of it. The tension that made backstage life uncomfortable was the same tension that crackled through their best performances and gave their comedy its electric, unpredictable quality. But friction has a way of accumulating, and by the early 1980s, it was becoming difficult to ignore. The central fault line in their partnership was creative control. While both men were credited as writers on all 6 of their major films produced between 1978 and 1984, Tommy Chong directed 4 of them. For Cheech, this imbalance was not a minor administrative detail. It was a fundamental statement about whose vision was being prioritized and whose contributions were being minimized. He later described the directorial arrangement as, in his own words, a very touchy thing. He felt that his instincts, his ideas, and his creative investment in their shared work were being systematically undervalued. The tension became particularly acute during the production of their 1981 film Nice Dreams, which Chong directed. By Cheech's account, Chong had developed what might charitably be described as a firm sense of directorial authority, and what Cheech described, rather less charitably, as a tendency to want to control everything. The writing, the direction, the major creative decisions, all of it increasingly flowed through Tommy. For a man who had been an equal partner from the very first improvised moment in a Vancouver strip club, being reduced to the role of creative passenger was genuinely painful. Things came to a head in 1985 over a project that had nothing to do with marijuana jokes or stoner movies. Cheech had written and recorded a song called Born in East L.A., a parody of Bruce Springsteen's Born in the USA that told the story of a Mexican-American man deported to Mexico despite being a citizen. It was sharp, funny, and politically pointed in a way their duo work rarely was. Cheech wanted Chong involved. Chong declined. The refusal was the final, audible crack in a foundation that had been quietly crumbling for years. Cheech went ahead without him, turning the song into a short film and eventually a full feature that performed respectably at the box office and received genuine critical appreciation. The partnership that had begun in a topless bar in Vancouver's Chinatown was, after 17 years, effectively over. Years later, with the clarity that distance sometimes provides, Tommy Chong offered an honest accounting of what had happened. He admitted that he had become something of a megalomaniac, his word, not a critic's characterization. The experience of directing, of having his word treated as final on set, had been intoxicating in a way that proved difficult to manage. The very authority that made him productive also made him impossible to work with as an equal. It is a strangely touching admission from someone who spent decades playing the most easygoing man in any room. Before there was Up in Smoke, before there were stoner albums and sold-out comedy tours, Tommy Chong was a working musician with a genuine brush with one of the most important record labels in American history. Bobby Taylor and the Vancouvers, the rhythm and blues group Tommy played guitar in during the mid to late 1960s, signed with Motown Records, which was at that point the most commercially successful African-American-owned business in the United States, and arguably the most culturally influential record label on earth. The Vancouvers released several singles on Motown and achieved modest chart success, but their most significant contribution to musical history may have had nothing to do with their own recordings. The group is widely credited with introducing Berry Gordy to a young family group from Gary, Indiana, the Jackson 5. Bobby Taylor had seen the Jacksons perform and was convinced of their potential. He arranged an audition with Gordy, and the rest belongs to pop music legend. Tommy Chong, future king of stoner comedy, played a supporting role in launching the career of one of the best-selling musical acts of all time. It is the kind of historical footnote that seems almost too strange to be true, and yet there it is. This musical background also explains something about Tommy Chong that casual fans sometimes miss. His instinct for performance was rooted not in comedy, but in rhythm. The timing that made his stoner character so effective, the perfectly placed pause, the slow burn of a reaction, the deadpan that stretched just long enough to become funny, was the timing of a musician who had spent years playing to audiences and understanding how silence functions in performance. Comedy and music share more DNA than people generally acknowledge, and Tommy's trajectory from one to the other was less of a left turn than it might initially appear. In the mid-1980s, the Friday the 13th franchise was one of the most commercially reliable horror properties in Hollywood, cranking out sequels with dependable regularity and delivering exactly what audiences expected: a masked killer, a scenic location, and a body count. The sixth installment, Friday the 13th Part 6, Jason Lives, released in 1986, was directed by Tom McLoughlin and is generally regarded by fans of the series as one of the stronger entries, notable for its self-aware humor and its willingness to acknowledge the inherent absurdity of its own premise. After Jason Lives performed well, McLoughlin found himself in the position of being a valued voice in the franchise's creative conversations. And he had an idea that was either brilliantly inspired or completely unhinged, depending on your perspective, and possibly both simultaneously. He pitched producer Frank Mancuso Jr. on a crossover that would have featured Cheech and Chong in a Friday the 13th film. The concept involved the duo stumbling into Jason's territory through one of two scenarios. Either they were running an illegal marijuana growing operation somewhere in the woods around Crystal Lake, or they had arrived as hopelessly unprepared camp counselors who were in so far over their heads that the supernatural horror around them barely registered through the chemical haze. The pitch, whatever its merits, never made it into production. The studio ultimately did not pursue it, and the franchise continued on its established path without a cannabis-themed comedy crossover. But the mere fact that the conversation happened at all tells you something important about Cheech and Chong's cultural reach in the mid-1980s. They were famous enough, and their brand was distinct enough, that a horror franchise producer considered their presence a legitimate creative option. They existed in the cultural imagination as a specific type, recognizable enough to function as a comedic counterweight to an established horror icon. That is a particular kind of stardom, and it is not nothing. The Unmade film also raises a genuinely entertaining hypothetical. How would Cheech and Chong have handled the horror genre? Their comedic style was built on characters who were largely impervious to normal social anxiety, men who floated through situations that would terrify most people because they were operating on an entirely different frequency. There is an argument to be made that their personas would have been genuinely effective comic foils for a slasher villain, precisely because their characters would have been too distracted to be appropriately frightened. The 1978 film Up in Smoke is widely considered the foundational text of stoner cinema, the movie that established the aesthetic, the tone, and the character archetypes that would define the genre for decades. Is full of memorable gags, but one of the most beloved visual jokes in the entire film is also one of the most misunderstood. The license plate reading MUFDVR, attached to a vehicle in one of the film's key sequences, has become an iconic piece of cinematic memorabilia. Most people assume it was dreamed up by a Hollywood prop department with a gift for lowbrow wordplay. The truth is considerably more interesting. The MUFDVR plate was not a prop. It was a real vanity license plate, and it was owned by a real person, specifically an officer of the Los Angeles Police Department. The precise nature of the irony here is worth sitting with for a moment. One of the most beloved visual jokes in a film that spent most of its running time celebrating illegal drug use and lampooning authority was, in its physical reality, the property of a law enforcement officer. Cheech's own father had been an LAPD officer. The comic universe, it seems, has a very specific sense of humor. The plate itself had a colorful road life before its cinematic moment. It began its career on an American Motors Gremlin, a car that was already something of a punchline in automotive circles before migrating to a T-Top Corvette and eventually settling on a customized Volkswagen Beetle, which is the configuration most closely associated with the film. The original owner reportedly held on to the plates long after the car they were attached to was retired, keeping them as a curiosity with their California DMV stickers intact. The plate's journey from a police officer's car to a counterculture cinema classic is, in miniature, a kind of compressed American comedy, authority and rebellion sharing the same small piece of aluminum without either one fully realizing it. When Up in Smoke was in its final stages before release, producer Lou Adler arranged an early screening for a select group of industry insiders, the kind of preview that could make or break a film's trajectory depending on how the room responded. Among those in attendance was Jack Nicholson, at that point already one of the most celebrated actors in Hollywood following his work in films like 5 Easy Pieces, Chinatown, and One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Nicholson's opinion carried genuine weight, and his presence at the screening was meaningful. There was, however, a complication. Nicholson had recently been in a car accident that left him with a dislocated shoulder. For anyone who has experienced even a moderate shoulder injury, the physical reality of that condition is difficult to overstate. Movement is painful, and sudden involuntary movements, the kind produced